Have you ever wondered what it takes for a man to bend the will of those who believe they own him? What forbidden knowledge could transform chains into instruments of liberation? Tonight, I'm bringing you a story so extraordinary, so meticulously hidden in the shadows of history, that even the most seasoned historians hesitate to speak its name. This isn't just another tale of resistance. This is the account of a man who wielded powers so mysterious, so incomprehensible to his time, that plantation owners across Louisiana whispered his name in terror after dark. I'm talking about abilities that defied every law written to contain him, methods so effective they sent tremors through the foundations of an entire system. If you're ready to witness how one individual turned the tables on oppression itself, using nothing but his mind and knowledge passed down through generations, then you need to stay with me until the very end. But before we descend into this labyrinth of manipulation, control, and ultimate retribution, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, control, and the human capacity for strategic brilliance. The masters thought they controlled everything. They were catastrophically wrong. Let's begin. The ruins still stand along Bayou La Fourche, skeletal remnants of what locals refuse to call by its original name. Moss hangs from collapsing beams like funeral shrouds, and on certain nights when fog rolls thick across the water, residents claim they hear voices, not screaming but chanting in rhythms that predate any language spoken in Louisiana. The air tastes of rust and rotted cypress and something else, something that makes dogs refuse to cross the property line even now, 173 years after the events that transformed this place into a monument of unspoken horror. This is where it happened. This is where a man named Ezekiel learned to dismantle mines with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a spider spinning its web. But to understand what Ezekiel became, you must first understand what they tried to make him. If you want to follow more cases like this, stories that shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about power and resistance, revealing truths that have been deliberately buried for generations, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single investigation. Belmont Plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of Louisiana Delta, a kingdom of sugarcane that fed its sweetness to the world while crushing human beings into fertilizer for its fields. The main house rose 3 stories high, white columns reflecting sunlight like polished bone, while behind it sprawled the quarters, 32 cabins arranged in perfect rows, each one precisely 12 feet by 14 feet, designed to house up to 8 bodies with the spatial efficiency of a slave ship's hold. Between these two worlds ran a careful geography of control. The overseer's house positioned to survey both mansion and quarters, the whipping post planted at the exact center of the compound where every window offered a clear view, the bell tower that dictated every moment from 4 in the morning until 10 at night. The sugar mill operated 20 hours during grinding season, its machinery fed by hands that bled into the cane juice, the iron rollers notorious for not stopping when fingers got caught, when entire arms got pulled into the mechanism, the protocol being to grab the machete and sever the limb before the whole body got consumed. The air smelled perpetually of burnt sugar and infected wounds, and underneath it all, the particular stench of fear that seeps into wood and earth when suffering becomes architecture. Master Henri Belmont ruled this domain with the methodical cruelty of a man who considered efficiency and terror to be complementary principles, who kept detailed ledgers noting which punishments produced the optimal balance between intimidation and productivity. But he had made one catastrophic miscalculation, one hiring decision that would ultimately unravel everything he had built. He had purchased a man who understood the invisible. Ezekiel arrived at Belmont in chains on a morning that smelled of magnolia and dread, sold off an estate in Haiti, where his previous owner had died under circumstances the auction house declined to specify. He was 37 years old, unusually tall at 6 feet 2 inches, with fingers that moved with surgical precision and eyes that seemed to catalog everything while revealing nothing. What distinguished Ezekiel from the moment he stepped onto Belmont soil was not his physical presence, but his inexplicable access. Within 3 months, Master Belmont had designated him as the plantation's medical attendant, a role that granted him privileges that bewildered and enraged the overseers. Ezekiel moved freely between the main house and the quarters, treated ailments for both the Belmont family and the enslaved population, maintained a small cabin behind the main kitchen where he kept his supplies and conducted his work. He spoke 5 languages fluently: French, English, Spanish, Creole, and something else, something he never named, and possessed knowledge of herbs, roots, and compounds that produced effects the plantation's official physician could neither explain nor replicate. When Madame Belmont suffered from migraines that left her bedridden for days, it was Ezekiel who prepared the tincture that brought relief within hours. When the overseer's son contracted a fever that 3 doctors had declared fatal, it was Ezekiel who kept him alive through 5 nights of crisis. This competence became his passport, his key to spaces and conversations that should have remained forever beyond his reach. The enslaved population began calling him the one who walks through walls, not because he possessed supernatural powers, but because doors that stayed locked for everyone else somehow opened when he approached. He attended to Master Belmont's gout, to the cook's arthritis, to the field hand's machete wounds, moving through the plantation's hierarchies with the fluid grace of water finding cracks in stone. But Ezekiel was not healing. He was mapping. He was learning the rhythms of power, the schedules of vulnerability, the precise moments when guards dropped and defenses weakened, and most critically, he was studying minds, how they broke, how they bent, how they could be reprogrammed through carefully calibrated combinations of chemistry, suggestion, and the exploitation of the primitive fears that civilization only pretends to transcend. Leave in the comments. Never give up on truth if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. The atrocities at Belmont followed a taxonomy of cruelty that Ezekiel documented in a ledger he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his cabin. Entries written in a cipher that blended 3 languages into something indecipherable to anyone who might discover it. He recorded the Thursday when Master Belmont ordered 15 lashes for a field hand named Moses, who had straightened his back for 3 seconds during the workday. The whip wielded by Overseer Dalton with such enthusiasm that strips of flesh hung from Moses's shoulders like Spanish moss, the man's children forced to watch from the front row as their father's blood painted the dirt. He recorded the systematic rape of women in the quarters, noting that Master Belmont's sons, Henri Jr., age 24, and Philippe, age 21, had established a rotation schedule, visiting different cabins on different nights with the casual entitlement of men selecting fruit from their own orchard, leaving behind pregnancies that would be counted as property increases in the plantation's annual inventory. He recorded the drowning of Old Testament, a man of 68 who had taught himself to read by studying discarded newspapers, his execution carried out in the horse trough, while the entire enslaved population was assembled to witness what happened to those who presumed to literacy. He recorded the separation of families during auction season, mothers torn from nursing infants, husbands sold to neighboring parishes while wives screamed themselves hoarse, children parceled out like livestock to the highest bidders. But Ezekiel did not record these events as a passive observer. He recorded them as a man taking measurements, calculating tolerances, determining the precise pressure points where the human psyche transforms from survival into something that transcends self-preservation. He watched faces during the punishments, noted who broke and who hardened, who turned away and who forced themselves to keep looking. He was learning the topography of trauma, mapping the territory where fear becomes fury, and with each entry in his hidden ledger, the architecture of his revenge grew more elaborate, more precise, more inexorable. The catalyst that transformed Ezekiel from documenting observer to active architect of retribution came on a March evening in 1851 when Overseer Dalton dragged Ezekiel's daughter, Naomi, into the barn. She was 16 years old, born during Ezekiel's previous enslavement in Haiti, the only family he had managed to keep through 2 sales and 1 ocean crossing. She had her mother's eyes. Ezekiel's wife had died during the passage to Louisiana, and her grandmother's gift for remembering stories, for carrying forward the knowledge that their captors tried desperately to erase. Dalton had been watching Naomi for months, with the predatory focus of a man who considers other people's humanity to be an inconvenient fiction. That March evening, he decided his patience had expired. What happened in that barn took 17 minutes according to the mental clock Ezekiel maintained while he stood outside, held back by 2 other overseers who gripped his arms and forced him to listen to his daughter's screams, to the sounds of her fighting, to the eventual terrible silence that meant either unconsciousness or the complete fracturing of will. When Dalton emerged, adjusting his belt with the satisfied expression of a man who had just exercised what he considered to be his natural right, he looked directly at Ezekiel and said, She's yours to patch up, doctor. Try to make sure she's functional by Monday. We need her in the fields." They released Ezekiel's arms. He did not attack. He did not rage. He walked into that barn with the controlled movements of a man entering a cathedral, and what he found there rearranged the fundamental chemistry of his soul. Naomi lay in the hay, her dress torn, blood on her thighs, eyes open but seeing nothing. Her body present but her mind fled to some internal distance where horror couldn't reach. Ezekiel knelt beside her, placed his hand on her forehead with the gentleness of handling sacred glass, and made a sound that was neither word nor cry but something more ancient, something that predated language. He stayed with her through the night, cleaning her wounds, holding her while she shook, whispering promises in a voice so quiet the words were meant for her alone. By dawn, when Naomi finally fell into something approximating sleep, Ezekiel had made his decision. The ledger of atrocities would now become a blueprint. The documentation would transform into action, and every man who had participated in the destruction of his daughter would experience something far worse than death. They would experience the systematic dissolution of the self. The antagonists at Belmont formed a constellation of cruelty, each man contributing his particular specialty to the machinery of oppression. Master Henri Belmont himself operated as the architect, a man who read agricultural journals like scripture and calculated profit margins with the dispassionate precision of someone who had successfully abstracted human suffering into numerical optimization. He wore custom-tailored suits imported from Paris, maintained correspondence with plantation owners across the South, comparing notes on punishment techniques and breeding strategies, and genuinely believed he was fulfilling a divine mandate to impose order on what he called the chaos of inferior races. His sons had inherited his conviction without his discipline. Henri Jr. possessed his father's cruelty magnified by alcoholism and sexual sadism, while Philippe combined violence with a petty vindictiveness that expressed itself in elaborate humiliations designed to break spirits rather than just bodies. But the true engine of daily terror was Overseer Marcus Dalton, a man who had worked his way up from poor white trash through the application of enthusiastic violence, who carried a whip braided from bullhide and weighted with lead tips, who had mastered the art of inflicting maximum pain while keeping property damage below replacement cost. Dalton had two assistants, Jacobson and Pierce, who functioned as his enforcers, men who enjoyed their work with the straightforward enthusiasm of dogs bred for fighting. This was the ecosystem that Ezekiel needed to dismantle. 5 men whose removal would create cascade effects through the entire plantation system. But the event that elevated his planning from theoretical to operational came during the harvest celebration of 1851, when Master Belmont decided to demonstrate what he called proper discipline in front of visiting plantation owners from Mississippi and Georgia. The demonstration involved Naomi. She had been working in the main house since the barn incident, assigned to domestic duties where Master Belmont could ensure her visibility, could parade her trauma as evidence of his dominion. During the celebration, while the masters drank cognac on the veranda and their wives pretended not to notice the screams that periodically emerged from the quarters, Naomi dropped a crystal decanter. It slipped from her hands that had not stopped shaking since March, and shattered across the imported Italian tile. Master Belmont stopped mid-conversation, looked at the spreading puddle of liquor and glittering shards, and saw an opportunity. He called for Dalton. He called for the entire household staff to assemble. And then, in front of his honored guests, he ordered Naomi stripped to the waist and whipped, not the usual 15 lashes, but 40, to be administered with theatrical slowness so that each impact could be properly appreciated. Ezekiel was required to stand at attention 6 feet away, maintaining his professional composure while watching his daughter's back transform into abstract art painted in blood. The visiting plantation owners nodded approvingly. Their wives fanned themselves and sipped lemonade. And when it was finished, when Naomi collapsed unconscious and Dalton coiled his whip with the satisfaction of a craftsman admiring his work, Master Belmont turned to Ezekiel and said, "Clean her up and have her back at work by morning. And Ezekiel, do remember that your position here is a privilege, not a right. We can always find another medical attendant." That night, while treating Naomi's wounds in his cabin, Ezekiel spoke aloud the plan that had been crystallizing in his mind for months. Naomi, conscious now, but hollowed out by pain, listened as her father described what he intended to do. When he finished, she reached for his hand and whispered a single word. When? The humiliation that finalized Ezekiel's transformation from planner to executioner occurred 2 weeks later, on a Sunday when Master Belmont hosted a garden party featuring a touring phrenologist from Charleston, who claimed he could determine intelligence and moral character through skull measurements. The phrenologist, a corpulent man named Dr. Horace Pemberton, had brought his calipers and measurement instruments, and Master Belmont proposed an entertainment. They would measure various skulls from the plantation population and demonstrate the scientific basis for racial hierarchy. Ezekiel was selected as the primary subject because, as Master Belmont explained to his laughing guests, "This one thinks he's quite clever. Let's see what science reveals." For 45 minutes, Ezekiel stood on the lawn while Dr. Pemberton took measurements, called out dimensions to a recording secretary, and delivered a running commentary on the obvious indicators of primitive development and structural limitations that explain intellectual inferiority. The guests applauded after each pronouncement. Master Belmont's daughters sketched the scene as a souvenir, and Henri Jr., drunk on bourbon and audience attention, walked behind Ezekiel and pressed his thumb against the base of his skull, saying, "Right here is where we keep them stupid. Nature's lock. Daddy's got the only key." The assembled crowd erupted in laughter. Ezekiel stood perfectly still, his face arranged in the mask of servile acceptance that he had perfected over decades, while inside his mind, something fundamental shifted into place with the final click of a locked tumbler finding its position. He had endured the torture of his daughter. He had survived the systematic destruction of everyone he had ever known. But this performance, this theatrical reduction of his humanity to entertainment for people whose greatest accomplishment was being born pale, this crystallized something in Ezekiel that transcended rage and entered the territory of absolute clarity. When Dr. Pemberton finally released him, patting him on the head like a dog who had performed a successful trick, Ezekiel returned to his cabin and pulled out his hidden ledger. On the final page, he wrote a single word in the cipher he had developed: Samedi. Saturday, August 16th, 1852. The date when harvest season would reach its peak, when every plantation in Louisiana would be focused on grinding cane and maximizing profit, when guards would be stretched thin and masters would be distracted by the mathematics of commerce. 5 months away. Sufficient time to prepare. Insufficient time for anyone to suspect. The countdown had begun. The recruitment phase required delicacy that bordered on artistry. Ezekiel could not simply approach potential conspirators with his plan. Discovery would mean immediate execution for everyone involved. Instead, he began with observation, identifying individuals whose trauma had transformed them not into broken submission, but into coiled readiness. People who maintained the performance of compliance while harboring cores of focused hatred. His first recruit was Solomon, the blacksmith, a man of 42 who had watched his wife sold away 8 years prior, and who possessed both physical strength and access to every metal tool on the plantation. Ezekiel began by treating an infected burn on Solomon's arm, during which he mentioned almost casually that certain plant compounds could induce temporary paralysis without leaving traces in the body afterward. Solomon's hands stopped moving. Their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but Solomon returned 3 days later with a persistent cough that required a follow-up consultation, during which Ezekiel described, in purely theoretical terms, how one might disable multiple armed men simultaneously if circumstances somehow required it. By the end of that second visit, Solomon had committed himself through silence and the slight nod that signified understanding. The second recruit was Miriam, who worked in the main house kitchen and who had lost 2 children to Master Belmont's habit of using enslaved children as trade goods when he needed to settle gambling debts. Miriam had access to food preparation and intimate knowledge of the family's routines, preferences, and vulnerabilities. Ezekiel recruited her through a series of conversations about mushrooms, specifically varieties that looked edible but contained compounds that induced vivid hallucinations, paranoia, and temporary psychosis when properly prepared and carefully dosed. Miriam proved to be an exceptionally quick study. The third recruit was Benjamin, a field hand who had taught himself rudimentary chemistry through observation and experimentation, who understood that the same fertilizers that made sugarcane grow could, with proper manipulation, become incendiary devices. The fourth was Rachel, who had been repeatedly brutalized by Philippe Belmont, and who possessed theatrical skills honed through years of performing submissiveness while calculating revenge. Each recruitment followed the same pattern: medical treatment that created private consultation, theoretical discussions about compounds and methods, the gradual revelation of shared purpose through careful verbal architecture that never explicitly stated the conspiracy, but built it through implication and mutual recognition. By June, Ezekiel had assembled a cell of 7 people, each with specific skills and access, each carrying trauma that had been refined into weaponized purpose. They met in his cabin after midnight, timing their gatherings to coincide with the new moon when darkness provided maximum cover. Ezekiel taught them the cipher he had developed. He distributed assignments. He established the timeline. And most critically, he began the chemical education that would transform them from victims into architects of psychological warfare. The plan had 3 phases. First, the systematic administration of compounds that would induce increasing levels of paranoia and suggestibility in the primary targets over a period of weeks, creating a baseline of mental instability that would make the final phase more effective. Second, the orchestration of a scenario during the harvest celebration that would isolate the targets while creating alibis for the conspirators. Third, the application of what Ezekiel called the method, a combination of inhaled and ingested compounds, environmental manipulation, and psychological techniques inherited from his grandmother in Haiti, procedures that would induce a state where the target's minds became programmable, where their deepest fears could be externalized and weaponized against them, where they would experience subjective eternities of customized horror, while objectively only hours passed. Ezekiel named this method after the Vodou LWA his grandmother had served, Baron Samedi, the master of the dead, the psychopomp who controlled the boundary between life and death, between sanity and dissolution. The name would eventually spread across Louisiana as plantation owners whispered in terror about the Samedi technique, a form of revenge so psychologically devastating that it destroyed not just individuals, but the mythology of invulnerability that sustained the entire system. But in June of 1852, gathered in a candlelit cabin while mosquitoes hummed against the screens and the night pressed close with humidity and secrets, 7 people listened as Ezekiel described exactly how they would dismantle their tormentors from the inside out. When he finished explaining, Solomon asked the only question that mattered. "When we do this, there's no going back. They'll hunt us until we're dead. You sure this is worth dying for?" Ezekiel looked around the circle of faces, each one marked by scars visible and invisible, each one representing someone who had already died in every way that mattered except for the final breath. "We're already dead," he said quietly. "This is how we haunt them." The preparation phase consumed June and July in a careful choreography of seeming normalcy, punctuated by minute acts of escalating sabotage. Ezekiel and Miriam began the chemical campaign against the primary targets, starting with Master Belmont himself. Miriam controlled breakfast preparation, which gave her access to the Master's morning coffee, a routine so sacred that the patriarch consumed it before engaging with any business whatsoever. Ezekiel provided her with a tincture derived from Datura stramonium, Jimson weed, carefully dosed at levels below obvious toxicity, but sufficient to induce subtle neurological effects over time. Increased irritability, mild paranoia, disrupted sleep patterns, and a growing sense that something indefinable was persistently wrong. The dosing followed a pattern of 2 days on, 2 days off, creating intermittent symptoms that Master Belmont would interpret as stress or age rather than poisoning. Simultaneously, Benjamin began strategic manipulations of the machinery in the sugar mill, creating minor malfunctions that required increased supervision from Overseer Dalton, stretching his attention and reducing the time he could devote to monitoring the enslaved population. Solomon started leaving tools in precisely wrong locations, subtle enough that no single incident would trigger investigation, but cumulatively creating an atmosphere of pervasive disorder that frayed nerves and multiplied suspicion. Rachel, working as a seamstress in the main house, began incorporating symbolic alterations into the family's clothing, shirts with seams that would split at moments of exertion, dresses with hems that would catch on furniture, small discomforts that accumulated into a background radiation of irritation. Each conspirator maintained meticulous documentation, marking successful interventions with symbols in the shared ledger, cross-referencing effects with Ezekiel's medical observations. By mid-July, the cumulative impact was becoming visible. Master Belmont had dismissed 2 servants for imagined theft. Dalton had increased the frequency and severity of punishments in response to his perception of increasing insubordination. And Henri Jr. had begun experiencing vivid nightmares that left him exhausted and volatile. The targets were being softened, primed, their baseline mental states destabilized in preparation for the final assault. But the most crucial preparation was the construction of the physical space where the final phase would occur. In the depths of the swamp that bordered Belmont's southern property line, 2 miles from the main house but still technically within plantation boundaries, stood the ruins of an earlier structure, a storage building that had been abandoned after a fire 15 years prior. Ezekiel and Solomon spent 3 weeks clearing the interior, reinforcing the walls, and installing the equipment that would transform the space into what Ezekiel called the theater. They brought in chains liberated from the blacksmith shop, a chair constructed to specific dimensions, mirrors positioned at precise angles, and most critically, the apparatus for delivering the chemical compounds that would form the foundation of the method. An incense burner that could be loaded with combinations of Jimson weed, henbane, and a third ingredient that Ezekiel never named, something he had carried from Haiti in a sealed vial that he claimed his grandmother had prepared from the venom of a particular toad found only in certain sacred groves. The mirrors were positioned to create recursive reflections, infinity tunnels that would fragment visual processing and destroy spatial orientation. The chair was designed to restrict movement while forcing the occupant into a posture that would accelerate physical discomfort and psychological vulnerability. The chains were unnecessary for restraint. The chemicals would handle that, but necessary for symbolism, for the ritualistic reversal of power that was as important as the destruction itself. By August 1st, the theater was complete. The conspirators had rehearsed their roles until each movement was automatic, until the entire sequence could be executed in darkness if necessary. The compounds had been prepared and sealed in containers designed for rapid deployment. The alibis had been established, and the targets, unknowingly primed by weeks of chemical and psychological manipulation, were ready to be harvested. The date was set: Saturday, August 16th, 1852. The night when masters would learn that there were forms of power they had never imagined, wielded by people they had convinced themselves were incapable of such sophistication. The countdown had reached single digits. The evening of August 15th arrived heavy with heat that seemed to thicken the air into something almost solid, the kind of oppressive humidity that made every breath feel like drowning. Belmont Plantation erupted into celebration as the harvest season reached its midpoint, Master Belmont hosting what he called his annual gratitude feast, a grotesque parody where he congratulated himself for his benevolent management, while the enslaved population provided entertainment through forced performances of song and dance. Performing gratitude, they did not feel for mercy that did not exist. The main house blazed with lantern light. Long tables stretched across the lawn laden with roasted pig, cornbread, sweet potatoes, food that the people who had produced it would taste only as leftovers, if at all. Master Belmont circulated among his guests, plantation owners from surrounding parishes who had traveled to participate in this festival of self-congratulation, each one trying to outdo the others with stories of successful harvests and profitable management strategies. Inside this carnival of plantation mythology, the conspirators moved through their assigned roles with mechanical precision, each action timed to the rhythm established during weeks of rehearsal. Miriam served drinks, ensuring that Master Belmont and his sons received specially prepared glasses, this time loaded with a higher concentration of the Datura tincture, combined with extracts that would produce profound drowsiness within 2 hours. Rachel performed with the singers, her voice carrying across the lawn while her eyes tracked the movements of Overseer Dalton, noting when he stepped away from the central gathering to patrol the perimeter, timing his circuit with the precision of a metronome. Solomon maintained his station at the forge, ostensibly on call for any emergency repairs, but actually monitoring the arrivals and departures of guests, ensuring that the planned sequence would not be interrupted by unexpected visitors. Benjamin worked the mill under torchlight, the machinery grinding steadily, providing both cover noise and a reason for him to remain mobile across the plantation grounds without suspicion. Ezekiel circulated as the medical attendant, available to treat the inevitable minor injuries and ailments that emerged during large gatherings, his medical bag containing not medicines, but the implements he would need for the final phase. As midnight approached, the crucial sequence began. Miriam, carrying a tray of desserts, approached Master Belmont with a concerned expression and whispered that his youngest daughter, Marie, appeared to be experiencing breathing difficulties in her bedroom, a claim designed to exploit the patriarch's one genuine point of emotional vulnerability, his 7-year-old daughter, who had nearly died of pneumonia 2 winters prior. Master Belmont immediately left the celebration, gesturing for Ezekiel to follow. As they climbed the stairs to the second floor, Henri Jr. and Philippe, already drowsy from their doctored drinks and observing their father's concern, decided to accompany them. Dalton, seeing the family mobilize, abandoned his patrol and entered the house to provide security. The 5 targets were now isolated from the main gathering, clustered in the upstairs hallway outside Marie's room, when Rachel's scream cut through the night from the direction of the quarters. It was a performance worthy of theatrical stages, a cry of such visceral terror that every person at the celebration froze. Dalton immediately ordered his assistants, Jacobson and Pierce, to investigate while he maintained position with the Belmont family. This split was exactly what Ezekiel had orchestrated. The assistants sprinted toward the quarters, where they would find Rachel collapsed outside her cabin, apparently having witnessed what she claimed was a threatening figure in the swamps, a description vague enough to require investigation, but specific enough to pull the assistant overseers away from the main house for at least 20 minutes. Meanwhile, in Marie's bedroom, Ezekiel made a show of examining the child, who was sleeping peacefully and exhibiting no respiratory distress whatsoever. Before Master Belmont could process this discrepancy and recognize the manipulation, Ezekiel turned to address the assembled family and spoke words he had rehearsed 10,000 times. "Master Belmont, I need to inform you of a serious situation in my medical cabin. Several doses of laudanum have gone missing from my supplies. I believe someone may be stealing medications, which could create significant liability for the plantation if enslaved persons gain access to such compounds. Given the current gathering, this may be an opportune moment for theft. I request permission for you and your sons to accompany me to conduct an immediate inventory before anything else disappears." It was a perfect manipulation, exploiting Master Belmont's paranoia, heightened by weeks of chemical priming, about theft and his obsessive need to control every aspect of plantation operations. He agreed immediately. Dalton, suspicious by nature and by profession, insisted on accompanying the group. The 6 men, Master Belmont, Henri Jr., Philippe, Dalton, Ezekiel, and Solomon, who had coincidentally arrived to assist with any heavy lifting, walked across the darkened grounds toward Ezekiel's cabin, leaving the celebration behind. They never reached the cabin. Halfway across the grounds, as they passed near the swamp's edge where vegetation grew thick enough to obscure sight lines from the main house, Benjamin emerged from the darkness holding a lantern and announced breathlessly that he had just witnessed someone running into the old storage building, the ruins in the swamp where stolen goods were sometimes hidden. Master Belmont, now fully committed to uncovering this imagined theft ring, ordered everyone to investigate immediately. They entered the swamp in single file, Ezekiel leading with a torch, the vegetation closing behind them like a mouth swallowing prey. 3 minutes later, they reached the ruins. The door stood ajar. Light flickered from within. Master Belmont pushed ahead, his sons and Dalton following, entering the structure that Ezekiel had transformed into his theater. The incense burner was already active, smoke rising from compounds that would induce the first stage of the method. Before any of the targets could register the wrongness of the scene, the mirrors, the chains, the chair, the absence of any stolen goods, Solomon slammed the door shut and dropped the reinforced crossbar into place. The trap had closed. The performance was about to begin. What happened inside that structure over the following 6 hours would become the foundation of legends that plantation owners would whisper about for decades, stories so disturbing that most refused to speak them aloud, referring instead to the Samedi method, or simply, that business in Louisiana. The actual sequence followed protocols that Ezekiel had refined through careful study of both his grandmother's teachings and his own systematic observations of psychological breaking points. The first phase involved environmental disorientation, accomplished through the combination of inhaled compounds and sensory manipulation. As the smoke from the incense burner filled the sealed space, the 5 targets began experiencing the initial effects: spatial distortion, time dilation, and the dissolution of the boundary between internal thought and external perception. The mirrors positioned at recursive angles created visual feedback loops that made it impossible to determine which reflections were real and which were iterations, fragmenting any sense of stable physical location. Ezekiel and Solomon wore cloth masks, treated with vinegar and charcoal, that filtered most of the smoke's effects, allowing them to maintain relative clarity while moving through the space like choreographed dancers, visible one moment and vanished the next. Their movements timed to exploit the target's deteriorating ability to track motion and maintain threat awareness. Master Belmont attempted to assert authority, demanding explanations, issuing orders, but his voice sounded strange even to himself, distorted by the acoustic properties of the space and his own neurological disruption. Henri Jr. lunged at where he thought Ezekiel was standing, only to collide with a mirror, the impact splitting his lip and introducing blood into an environment where every sensation would be magnified and reinterpreted. Philippe dropped to his knees, vomiting, the compound's effects overwhelming his system faster than his brother's. Dalton, with the survival instincts of someone whose profession depended on recognizing danger, drew his knife and pressed his back against the wall, trying to maintain defensive position. But the smoke was already rewiring his threat perception, making him flinch at shadows while ignoring actual presences. The second phase began when each target was individually isolated and restrained in the chair Ezekiel had constructed. This process, which in objective time required perhaps 90 minutes, felt subjectively eternal to each participant, their sense of temporal progression completely destroyed by the compound saturating their systems. Master Belmont went first, not because Ezekiel hated him most, though he did, but because breaking the patriarch would create psychological leverage over his sons, who would hear his screams and know that their father's authority offered no protection. Ezekiel positioned Belmont in the chair, the restraints unnecessary because the compounds had already stolen his capacity for coordinated movement, and began the core of the method. The administration of a second compound, this one delivered through direct nasal absorption, derived from that sealed vial from Haiti, the substance his grandmother had called the key that opens the door where nightmares live. The effect was immediate and absolute. Master Belmont's pupils dilated until his eyes became black voids. His breathing accelerated to shallow gasps. And then Ezekiel began speaking in a voice that was simultaneously his own, and something channeled through him from older sources, speaking in Creole, and that unnamed fifth language, words that bypassed conscious processing and spoke directly to the ancient structures in the brain that housed primordial terror. He described in methodical detail every atrocity Master Belmont had ever committed, but not as past events, as present, ongoing experiences. Each whipping Belmont had ordered, Ezekiel made him feel the lash across his own back, the neural pathways hijacked by compounds and suggestion, until his nervous system generated authentic pain signals indistinguishable from actual tissue damage. Each rape his sons had committed under his tacit approval, Ezekiel made him experience as violation of his own body. The psychological mechanism of dissociation, prevented by the chemical architecture, forcing him to remain present in the horror. Each family separation, each sale, each casual cruelty, Ezekiel transformed into experiential memory that Belmont's rewritten consciousness accepted as happening right now, in this eternal present where time had lost meaning and suffering had become the only reality. But the true sophistication of the method lay not in recreating experienced atrocities, but in manifesting the fears that Belmont had never consciously acknowledged. Ezekiel had studied this man for 18 months, had cataloged his nightmares through overheard midnight conversations with his wife, had identified the core terror that animated all his violence, the fear that the people he controlled were not actually inferior, that his dominance was arbitrary rather than natural, that he was surrounded by individuals who possessed capacities he could neither understand nor match, and that someday they would recognize their power and unmake him completely. Ezekiel made this fear corporeal. He described with hallucinogenic precision a world where Belmont was the slave, where every humiliation he had inflicted was reversed, where he stood on auction blocks while people who looked like Ezekiel evaluated his teeth and muscles, where his children were torn from his arms and sold like livestock, where his wife was brutalized while he was forced to watch, where his body was worked until it broke and then discarded like trash. The compounds ensured that Belmont did not experience this as hypothetical but as memory, as something that had already happened and was still happening, and would always be happening in an eternal loop of deserved retribution. When Ezekiel finally released him from the chair, after what might have been 20 minutes in objective time but felt like years in Belmont's shattered consciousness, the plantation owner's face had transformed into a mask of incomprehension, tears and saliva running freely, his expensive suit soaked with urine and sweat, his identity fundamentally disrupted at its core architecture. Ezekiel moved him aside and brought Henri Jr. to the chair. The process repeated with variations specific to the son's particular cruelties, the compounds and suggestions customized to his psychology, his screams harmonizing with his father's ongoing whimpering. Then Philippe. Then Dalton. Then finally Jacobson and Pierce, who had been captured when they returned from their investigation of Rachel's false alarm and walked directly into Benjamin's ambush. Each man received a personalized experience, calibrated to destroy not his body, which would have been mercy, but his fundamental sense of self, leaving behind something that looked human but had been hollowed out and refilled with unprocessable trauma. By dawn, when the compounds began to wear off and the targets regained something approximating physical coherence, if not psychological integrity, Ezekiel gathered them in a line against the wall and spoke his final words to them in English. "You will return to the plantation. You will remember everything that happened here. And you will never speak of it to anyone, because the moment you try to describe this experience to another human being, you will relive it entirely. That is the gift my grandmother gave me, the ability to create memories that defend themselves. Tell no one, suffer in silence, and know that every person you ever brutalized is laughing at you from somewhere you cannot see." Then he opened the door and released them into the pre-dawn darkness. The 5 men stumbled back toward the plantation like refugees from a disaster that had no name in any language they knew, their clothing torn and filthy, their movements uncoordinated, their expressions vacant. The celebration had long since ended, guests departed, the enslaved population locked in the quarters for the night. They entered the main house through the kitchen, tracked mud and swamp water across imported Italian tile, and dispersed to separate rooms without speaking. Miriam, stationed near the kitchen to monitor their return, noted the time. 4:47 a.m. Phase 3 had concluded successfully. No one had died. Nothing had been physically destroyed. And yet 5 men who had ruled through violence and conviction of their own invulnerability had been comprehensively unmade. But Ezekiel's plan included one additional component, what he called the echo, a series of actions designed to ensure that the psychological destruction would achieve maximum cultural impact rather than remaining isolated to 5 individuals. At 6 a.m., when the plantation bell rang for morning work call, Ezekiel initiated this final phase by approaching Master Belmont in his study, where the patriarch sat staring at nothing and announcing in a voice loud enough to be heard by the house servants, "Master Belmont, sir, I must inform you that Overseer Dalton and the others were speaking last night about a serious medical condition. They requested my discretion, but I believe you should be informed that they may be experiencing episodes of—" He paused theatrically, "mental instability. I recommend close observation." This planted the seed that would be necessary for the next stage. Throughout the morning, subtle interventions occurred across the plantation. Rachel accidentally mentioned to the cook that she had seen Master Belmont weeping in the garden before dawn. Solomon told the stable master that Henri Jr. had been found sleeping in the horse trough, fully clothed, claiming he needed to wash off the hands. Benjamin spread word among the field hands that Overseer Dalton had forgotten the whip during morning inspection, an unthinkable lapse for a man whose entire identity centered on that instrument of control. Each piece of information seemed innocuous individually, but collectively constructed a narrative of pervasive dysfunction among the plantation's power structure. The enslaved population began recognizing that something fundamental had shifted, that the men who had terrorized them were operating in a diminished capacity. Slowly, carefully, small acts of defiance emerged, a field hand straightening his back and maintaining that posture for 5 full seconds while staring directly at Dalton, who flinched and looked away. A domestic servant walking through a doorway before Henry Jr., rather than waiting for permission to pass. These were microscopic rebellions, but on a plantation where total submission had been the absolute rule, they represented tectonic shifts. And crucially, the targets did not respond with their customary violence. They could not. The method had implanted something deeper than fear. It had installed a fundamental uncertainty about reality itself, a pervasive sense that any assertion of dominance might trigger the return of that experiential hell, that any attempt to re-establish control might open the door back to that place where time dissolved and suffering became infinite. By afternoon, Master Belmont had locked himself in his study. By evening, Henri Jr. was drunk to the point of incoherence. By midnight, Dalton had abandoned his post entirely, retreating to his quarters where he sat in darkness, flinching at sounds no one else could hear. The power structure had not been overthrown. It had been hollowed from within, left standing but fundamentally inoperative. And then Ezekiel initiated the exodus. At 2 a.m. on August 18th, he moved through the quarters waking specific individuals. Everyone who had been part of the conspiracy, plus their families, plus anyone else who wanted to risk everything for the possibility of freedom. The plan was simple. Walk into the swamp, follow the waterways north to communities of Maroons, escaped slaves who had established hidden settlements in Louisiana's vast wetlands, and disappear into networks that had existed for decades beneath the mythology of total plantation control. Naomi, still recovering but determined, would come. Rachel, who had nothing left to lose, would come. 47 people in total decided that this fractured moment offered their only chance. They gathered what they could carry, took food from the storage cellars that no one was currently monitoring, liberated tools from the unmanned forge, and simply walked away from Belmont Plantation, while the power structure that should have stopped them sat paralyzed by unprocessable trauma. The column of freed people moved through darkness like a river finding its course, guided by Solomon and Benjamin who knew the waterways, protected by the knowledge that pursuit would be delayed by the plantation's psychological disintegration. As dawn broke and they reached the deep swamp where pursuit became impossible, Ezekiel turned back for one final look at the plantation that had tried to contain him. The main house stood white and perfect against the rising sun, columns gleaming, completely intact. Nothing burned. No blood had been spilled. The architecture of oppression remained physically unmarked. But everyone within those walls had learned that power was negotiable, that dominance was performance, and that there existed forms of retribution more devastating than any physical violence. Ezekiel had not destroyed Belmont Plantation. He had demonstrated that it had always been destroyable. Then he turned north and walked into legend. The aftermath of what became known as the Samedi incident propagated through Louisiana's plantation network with the speed of epidemic disease, though the actual mechanics of what had occurred remained shrouded in deliberate obscurity that made the event more terrifying rather than less. Master Belmont never filed an official report about the escape. To do so would require explaining how 47 enslaved people had walked away from his plantation without resistance, which would necessitate acknowledging the complete collapse of security and authority that had preceded it. Instead, he claimed the escapees had scattered individually over several nights, a lie that fooled no one but allowed him to maintain the fiction of control. But plantation owners talk, especially when fear is involved, and within 2 weeks every landowner in the parish had heard some version of the story. That a medical attendant at Belmont had used African witchcraft, or voodoo poisons, or mind control techniques to render the entire white power structure helpless. That men had been found wandering the grounds in states of complete psychological collapse. That Overseer Dalton had resigned his position and fled to Texas without explanation. That Henri Jr. and Philippe had become reclusive alcoholics who refused to supervise fieldwork anymore. That Master Belmont himself had aged 10 years in a single night and now conducted all plantation business through written correspondence because he could no longer bear to look directly at the people he owned. The details varied wildly. Some versions claimed Ezekiel had used snake venom. Others said he had called down spirits. Still others insisted he had employed hypnosis techniques learned from European mesmerists. But the core message remained consistent. An enslaved man had identified vulnerabilities in the psychology of dominance that no amount of whips or chains could defend against, and he had weaponized those vulnerabilities with devastating precision. By September 1852, reports began emerging from other plantations of similar incidents, though whether these were authentic cases or panicked misinterpretations of unrelated events remained unclear. In Ascension Parish, a plantation owner became convinced his entire enslaved population was plotting against him using invisible methods and fled to New Orleans, leaving his property to be managed by relatives. In St. James Parish, an overseer claimed he was being haunted by an enslaved man he had previously punished, experiencing vivid nightmares and waking hallucinations that drove him to suicide. In Iberville Parish, 3 enslaved people vanished from a plantation after the owner and his 2 sons simultaneously fell ill, with symptoms doctors described as nervous collapse precipitated by unknown environmental factors. Whether these events were inspired by Ezekiel's method, executed by people who had learned techniques from the spreading rumors, or simply the result of heightened paranoia projecting ordinary occurrences into sinister patterns, the effect was identical. The mythology of absolute control began fracturing. Plantation owners started hiring additional overseers, instituting new security protocols, restricting access to medical supplies and certain plant species. But these defensive measures could not address the fundamental vulnerability Ezekiel had exposed. That dominance maintained through psychological terrorism was itself vulnerable to psychological counterterrorism. That people who believed themselves invulnerable could be destroyed precisely through that belief. The Louisiana state legislature convened emergency sessions to discuss the growing threat of chemical and psychological warfare employed by the enslaved population, passing laws that prohibited enslaved persons from possessing or handling certain plants, from learning medical skills, from gathering in groups larger than 5 without white supervision. But laws could not address nightmares. They could not prevent plantation owners from lying awake, wondering if their coffee had been doctored, if their medical attendant was studying them rather than healing them, if the apparent submission they saw daily was performance-concealing calculation. By early 1853, the Samedi method had been officially recognized in plantation management journals as a genuine threat requiring systematic countermeasures, though no one could agree on what those countermeasures should be because no one actually understood how the method worked. The journals published warnings, techniques for identifying potential practitioners, recommendations for psychological screening of enslaved persons who possessed medical knowledge. But these publications only spread awareness of the method's existence, making it more legendary rather than less, transforming Ezekiel from individual into archetype, from person into possibility. Some plantation owners responded by prohibiting all medical treatment of enslaved persons by anyone other than white physicians, a policy that increased mortality rates and decreased productivity, while failing to address the underlying threat. Others responded by attempting to identify and preemptively execute anyone who might possess dangerous knowledge, creating waves of violence that only deepened the population's resentment and increased the probability of resistance. The method had become self-replicating, not through direct transmission but through the fear of its existence, which was sufficient to destabilize the psychological foundations of the entire system. The hunt for Ezekiel began in late August 1852, when Louisiana authorities, pressured by plantation owners demanding action against what they called the most dangerous fugitive in state history, assembled a specialized force of slave catchers led by a man named Garrett Webb, a tracker notorious for his success rate and his collection of branded scars he had taken from captured escapees as trophies. Webb was given unlimited resources and a mandate to bring back Ezekiel alive if possible. Plantation owners wanted him interrogated to reveal the specific compounds and techniques he had used, or dead if necessary, with the corpse publicly displayed as a warning. The pursuit lasted 4 months and covered 300 miles of Louisiana wetlands. Webb's force-tracking rumors and occasional confirmed sightings as Ezekiel moved through the network of maroon communities that existed in the spaces between plantations, settlements hidden in swamps and forests, where fugitives had built entire societies beyond white control. The chase became legendary in itself, generating stories of Webb's force finding abandoned camps still warm, of tracks that seemed to multiply impossibly, of local enslaved populations who claimed to have no knowledge of any fugitives while clearly coordinating to misdirect the hunters. Ezekiel was moving north, attempting to reach free territory, but the route required navigating through hundreds of miles where recapture meant certain death, where every white person was a potential threat, where survival depended on the assistance of people who risked everything to provide it. The manhunt finally converged on a location near Natchitoches in December 1852. When an informant, reports differed on whether this person was enslaved, free or white, motivated by promised reward money, or coerced through threat, provided Webb's force with intelligence that Ezekiel and approximately 15 other fugitives were sheltering in an abandoned chapel 3 miles from the Red River. Webb surrounded the structure at dawn on December 17th, bringing 20 armed men, and called for surrender. What followed became disputed territory where fact and mythology collapsed into each other. According to Webb's official report, the fugitives refused surrender and opened fire with weapons they had somehow acquired, initiating a firefight that lasted 3 hours and resulted in the deaths of all 15 fugitives plus 2 of Webb's men. According to accounts that circulated among Louisiana's enslaved population, the chapel had not been abandoned, but was a functioning sacred space for a marooned community. That Webb's force had no evidence Ezekiel was actually present but attacked anyway, and that the firefight consisted primarily of Webb's men massacring people who had limited weapons and no realistic chance of escape. Both versions agreed on certain facts. The chapel was set ablaze during the confrontation. 15 bodies were recovered from the ruins, and among them was a tall man approximately 38 years old, with burn scars on his hands, consistent with someone who worked with chemicals and heat. Webb identified this body as Ezekiel based primarily on height and age, though the fire damage made definitive identification impossible. The corpse was transported back to Belmont Parish and displayed in the town square for 3 days, as proof that the state could neutralize even the most dangerous threats to plantation order. Master Belmont was invited to identify the body. He looked at the charred remains for 15 seconds and confirmed the identification, though whether he actually recognized Ezekiel or simply needed to believe the threat was eliminated remained ambiguous. The body was then buried in an unmarked grave outside the town cemetery. Enslaved persons were not permitted burial in consecrated ground, and Webb collected his reward of $2,000. The official narrative declared the matter closed, but almost immediately counter-narratives began proliferating. Multiple people across Louisiana claimed to have seen Ezekiel after December 17th, in New Orleans in January, in Natchez in February, in Memphis in March. Sightings that were either genuine, cases of mistaken identity, or deliberate mythology building by communities that needed to believe the man had survived. Some accounts claimed that Ezekiel had never been at the chapel at all, that he had already crossed into free territory before Webb's raid, that the tall, burned corpse belonged to someone else entirely. Other accounts suggested that Ezekiel had died exactly as Webb reported, but that the method had somehow survived him, passed to others who continued applying it across Louisiana and beyond. Still other accounts took positions that transcended conventional categories of truth, claiming that Ezekiel had achieved a form of existence beyond normal mortality, that he moved through the nightmares of plantation owners as a persistent presence, that he had become something more than individual and had transformed into the living embodiment of a particular form of retribution. The historical record cannot definitively confirm which version is accurate. What can be confirmed is that reports of Samedi incidents continued occurring for at least 2 more years across Louisiana and into Mississippi, that plantation owners continued reporting psychological breakdowns among their populations that defied conventional explanation, and that the method, real or imagined, became a permanent feature of the psychological landscape of American slavery, a reminder that dominance always contains the seeds of its own destruction. The legacy of Ezekiel and the Samedi method extended far beyond the immediate aftermath, embedding itself in the cultural DNA of American resistance movements and establishing methodological frameworks that would reappear in various forms for generations. In the immediate years following 1852, the method became something that existed simultaneously as historical event, as practical technique, and as mythological archetype. Among enslaved populations across the South, Samedi became a password, a signal of deeper knowledge, a way of identifying others who understood that resistance could take forms beyond physical revolt. Stories about Ezekiel were told in the quarters after dark, each retelling adding layers of detail and symbolism, transforming the historical person into a folk hero whose powers grew with each narrative iteration. In some versions, he could render himself invisible. In others, he could kill with a glance. In still others, he had not died at all but had escaped to Haiti, where he trained others in the method, preparing to return someday and finish what he had started. These stories served multiple functions. They provided psychological sustenance to people living under conditions of total domination, offered a template for imagining resistance even when physical rebellion seemed impossible, and most critically, they maintained the threat of the method's reality in the minds of those who benefited from enslavement. Plantation owners could dismiss individual stories as superstition, but the collective weight of the mythology created real effects, increased paranoia, defensive expenditures, psychological strain that accumulated over time into genuine vulnerability. Some historians have argued that the Semitic method contributed to the growing instability that would eventually culminate in the Civil War, not through direct causation, but by demonstrating that the psychological foundations of slavery were more fragile than its proponents wanted to believe. Others have traced connections between techniques attributed to Ezekiel and later movements. The use of psychological warfare by resistance groups during Reconstruction, the strategic cultivation of white paranoia by civil rights activists in the 1960s, even modern therapeutic approaches to treating trauma that acknowledge the malleability of consciousness and the power of suggestion to rewrite experiential memory. But perhaps the most enduring legacy exists in the physical landscape itself. The ruins of Belmont Plantation still stand, never rebuilt, the property having been abandoned by the Belmont family within 5 years of the incident. Local residents claim the site is haunted, though what exactly haunts it remains ambiguous. Ghosts of the enslaved who suffered there, or ghosts of the masters who perpetrated that suffering, or something more abstract, the persistent resonance of the moment when power revealed its own mortality. Historians and archaeologists have surveyed the site multiple times, looking for evidence of the theater Ezekiel constructed in the swamp, but nothing has ever been found. Either it was destroyed, or its location has been deliberately obscured, or it never existed in the physical form that stories describe. What does exist, confirmed through multiple sources, is a small cemetery 3 miles north of the old plantation, unmarked on any official maps, but carefully maintained by local families who claim descent from those who escaped in August 1852. Among the simple markers is one stone, installed sometime in the 1920s by unknown parties, carved with a single name, Ezekiel, and beneath it, a phrase in Creole, Li te montre, nu que nous te lib tout temps. He showed us we were free all along. Whether this marks an actual grave or functions as memorial to an idea, whether Ezekiel's body rests there or somewhere else or nowhere at all, the stone serves its purpose. It confirms that someone existed, that something happened, that the mythology has roots in events that reshaped reality. Scholars continue debating the historical accuracy of various accounts, parsing slave narratives and plantation records in newspaper archives, trying to separate documented fact from accumulated legend. But for the communities who maintain that cemetery and tell those stories, the distinction matters less than the truth the legend carries. That power maintained through terror is always vulnerable to counter-terror. That knowledge can be weaponized as effectively as any physical tool, and that there are forms of freedom that exist beyond the physical breaking of chains. The freedom that comes from demonstrating to both oppressor and oppressed that dominance is performance, that invulnerability is illusion, and that every system of control contains within it the precise tools necessary for its own dismantling. Ezekiel's legacy is not that he freed himself. Many people did that. His legacy is that he demonstrated how to free the enslaved from their psychological chains, while simultaneously imprisoning their captors in psychological cages of unending fear. He weaponized their own brutality against them. He turned their certainty into their vulnerability. And in doing so, he created a template that can never be fully erased, a reminder that intelligence, knowledge, and strategic thinking can overcome apparently insurmountable disparities in physical power. The method survives, not as a specific formula, but a